Well, we're actually going to talk to Peter Hitchens now. He is a columnist for The Mail on Sunday, a valiant defender of free speech and someone who really thinks about things in a very different way to most of the media in Britain today. I'm delighted Peter is with me. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Peter, what was your reaction when you heard about this 77th Brigade, what it was? We knew it existed, but in terms of what it was doing and the targeting of you as someone who has on numerous occasions pointed out what the government, in your view, is doing wrong and has done wrong on lockdown. Was this a surprise to you? Or, I mean, it's very sinister, clearly.
Well, no, there's no surprise. We knew that this body existed. And of course, there is a perfectly good justification for having some part of the British defence operation targeting information warfare, because there is a lot of information warfare, and it is crucial in combat and conflict. So I'm not against that. No one's against that as such. What appears to be happening, whatever happened to me, we don't know. Everything happened to me because Big Brother Watch did what they could with freedom of information and subject access reviews to find out. And I was actually monitored by something called a rapid response unit rather than the 77th Brigade. Other people, I think, were. And we carried in the Mail on Sunday yesterday a fascinating piece by a whistleblower from the 77th saying how very much he disapproved of what he found himself doing and how it was wrong. It shouldn't have been a surprise to people if they'd been paying attention. The real question is what happens next once the government starts monitoring. And the other real question, fundamentally, is should governments be monitoring hostile comment on their policies? In my view, is absolutely not in free countries. In free countries, you're allowed to say anything legal is to say you can't incite crime, but you can criticize the government and you can criticize its policies. The idea that someone sitting in Whitehall is scraping across the internet trying to find people dissenting is bad enough. The other key thing, if you read the fascinating stuff in the Mail on Sunday, which is obviously still online, is that it's pretty clear that the government had access to the big web companies at a higher level than you or I would. For instance, if you have trouble with Twitter or YouTube, you don't know where to turn. But the government knew where to go, and it's reasonable to assume that in that case, the big web companies might possibly have paid attention to the government's concerns about certain people. We don't know. You have to put a lot of twos and twos together here to try and make a full sum. Because some people think that freedom of information is a magic power which forces government to disgorge all the information out. It isn't. It can refuse to answer some questions, or it can just fail to answer some questions, and it's quite hard to actually get the information commissioner to then enforce it. And it's not, what we have not got is a perfect picture. What we have got is clear signs that the government is doing two things: taking an improper interest in what people think, and in a position to influence the way in which that is then treated on the internet. And you will know, because it happened to talk radio during the great COVID panic, that at one point you had and stuff was not being carried. And you also probably recall the interview I did with Mike Graham, some of which disappeared in the YouTube version. So about a minute and a quarter of the interview I did with Mike just didn't actually appear on the YouTube version. And then there was a very curious example of the interview I did with Trigonometry, Konstantin Kirsin and his friend. I'd done one with them before, and they'd been quite pleased, and so had I, by the very large audiences we received. So you can't, there's only one reason for what happened on this occasion. They talked to me about the COVID panic at some length, and they put the thing out on their usual channels, and they were astonished to find that it simply wasn't getting the audience that they had expected or thought it deserved. And there is only one conclusion I think you can draw from this, which is that there are methods, algorithms, which can be used by whom we don't know, to diminish the impact of stuff on the internet, which somebody somewhere doesn't want people to see. This is a form, undoubtedly, of censorship. I think serious, sensible people are against censorship. It's not to say, if you go, for instance, as I've been many times to say to Israel, you accept when you go there that if you write anything which is militarily sensitive, then it is subject to actually quite light censorship in my experience. But they can come and say to you, look, this would give something away. And I think you'll find if reporters now reporting from Ukraine are under a pretty heavy censorship about where and when explosions have happened and so forth. That's not unreasonable in wartime, but in peacetime, during what is basically supposedly a major fight against a major disease. Is COVID supposed to be reading the newspapers so it can make attacks on places which are undefended? Of course, COVID can't read newspapers. The only people who are benefiting from any censorship would be the authorities. And it's just, it shouldn't be happening in a free society. People should be very concerned about it. I very strongly recommend that anybody who gets, it's, as I say, it's all on the web, read the whistleblower's account from a soldier who was in the 77th Brigade and see what he thought about what he was doing and how very much he regrets having been involved in it. This should not be going on. And I take it back really to the advent of the first new Labour government in 1997, an extraordinary manifesto. People have forgotten that Blair, in his introduction to that 97 manifesto, said that the new Labour was the political arm of the British people as a whole. It's an astonishing claim in a country as divided as this, to claim that the government speaks for everybody. But once governments start getting ideas like that into their heads, as they did during COVID, and as I should add, as they're doing during the Ukraine war, that there's only one view, the government has it, the people have it. Anybody who dissents from it is therefore open to be targeted in this sort of way. And it begins with monitoring. It moves on to shadow banning. And where does it end?
Well, I think you're making really good points and they're resonating with the audience. And the point in Ukraine is perhaps one we'll get into in a minute or two. Let me just read a couple of things that our listeners have been saying. Graham Collins has been in touch. He says, the latest scandals, Zahawi and the 77th Brigade, must ring the death knell for this government. Many of the current cabinet must have known about the activities of the 77th and the PM must have signed it off in his position as Chancellor. This government is rotten to the core, says Graham. Also, Ellie has been in touch. He says, I was labelled a vile conspiracy theorist, Peter, for my views. I was unfriended, I was ignored, all stoked by the mainstream media, but I'd heard about the 77th Brigade spying on us 2 years ago, but even I did not think this was possible. I'm so glad the truth is coming out. I feel vindicated. And one person has been in touch to say it is a brigade, not a division. A division normally contains 3 brigades. I did not know that, and I apologise for that, for making that mistake. But, I mean, Peter Hitchens, it is an interesting one, isn't it? Because a lot of people thought this was going on. Do you feel vindicated in your, I mean, given that you are being monitored or were being monitored by the 77th Brigade, and because you are clearly seen as someone who's a thorn in the side of the establishment, is that in some way actually a badge of honour?
I'm not, well, perhaps, but then practically, if you annoy people, and the great Lord Northcliffe, founder of my newspaper group, said that news is what somebody wants to suppress and keep out of the newspapers, and any kind of news or indeed comment which is inconvenient to authority and to people in positions of power is going to annoy people. And if you don't annoy people, in my view, you're not doing your job properly as a journalist. But so I would say that it would simply be a sign that I had been doing my job rather than honour as such. But one of your listeners, Graham, I think, said, well, the government's a terrible mess, should go, and all the rest of it. But what would be the alternative? If you got rid of this government, then you would get the Labour Party, which completely supported all the COVID measures, and is also currently pretty much arm in arm, shoulder to shoulder with the government on the Ukraine issue. There is no proper opposition in this country.
For your call. I'm going to bring these and extra points as well to Peter Hitchens, who's still with us, the Mail on Sunday columnist. Peter, I wonder, in terms of all of this stuff in regard to monitoring of journalists like you, I wonder if leaders have been emboldened by their success, actually, in terms of imposing draconian restrictions. Perhaps they feel more emboldened to impose draconian things, for example, by calling it a climate emergency, which is something I always feel a little bit worried about. They called COVID a public health emergency and people responded. If you call it a climate emergency, do you think people will kind of bow their heads again?
I think demonstrably they have done, and Parliament has done as well. A lot of the legislation on this has been passed with almost no opposition at all, either in terms of spoken opposition or votes. And it's quite extraordinary how in, 15 years, really, Parliament has changed from being a chamber with 2 opposing parties in it to an almost unanimous chamber of deputies, like something out of the old Warsaw Pact, which agrees about everything. So I think they are succeeding, and they're getting used to it. I think the population are getting used to it. I think people often expect that if democracy and freedom were to come to an end, it would be a military coup and the radio broadcasting martial music. It's not going to be like that. As if our freedom was taken away, it would be taken away gradually in slice after slice, and each slice will be so small no one could really care enough to protest. By the time you've had enough slices, you've got the whole sausage. And this is what seems to me very much to be happening. People are far too complacent about it. And each instance which arises, you can always argue yourself out of getting particularly disturbed about it. And there's no sign at all in either of the political parties that there is any serious opposition to these changes. And no sign at all that we're going back to the circumstances I remember, say, in the 1960s and 1970s, where the country was completely divided over many issues, foreign and domestic policy, whether it be the Vietnam War or trade unionism or whatever it was. There were two sides in Parliament, and they were very definitely fighting each other on this issue. And there was no dishonor in holding one view or the other. It was considered reasonable to disagree. Now, increasingly, disagreement itself is targeted. So during the COVID panic, people like me were falsely called COVID deniers. They were denied it for a moment, and all kinds of other things as well. And now during the Ukraine war, those of us who doubt that the policy of pursuing what looks like a very long and bloody and destructive war in Ukraine is right, and think that we should be pursuing as fast as we can some attempt to reach a peaceful compromise, those people are called Putin apologists and war crimes deniers and all kinds of other insulting. Actually, the insults directed against dissent are getting much fiercer and much more damaging. And I feel as this happens time and time, that the moment when it will actually become a prosecutable offence to disagree with official policy is growing closer, inch by inch, yard by yard.
Do you think that will actually happen, that we'll have a sort of almost thought crime kind of idea in terms of an offence, Peter?
Well, we know that the police already have begun to patrol social media, particularly Twitter, for things which they disapprove of. I think that the cleverest trick of the modern world is that instead of repressing people by prosecuting them and throwing them to prison, it represses them generally by driving them from their jobs or silencing them in other ways, so they cease to appear on television and radio, and they're not heard anymore. And Amnesty International is never going to intervene in the country and say that such and such a person hasn't been invited on Question Time for a couple of years.
Who could you possibly be referring to, Peter?
Sorry?
Who could you possibly be referring to?
Yeah, quite. But I mean, I did in fact get back on Question Time before Christmas, which was an amazing change. But you can, if you're in a position like me where you get a certain amount of access to broadcasting, it's very interesting how on certain issues the calls just dry up and people don't want to talk to you. And the big ones recently have particularly been COVID and particularly in Ukraine. And these are the things on which I think, if there had been, and talkradio did a lot to make sure that there was, but if there had been a more widespread debate in this country during the COVID panic, I think the policies the government pursued would have been better, more responsible, more proportionate. Yeah. We'd have done ourselves less damage, inflation wouldn't be so bad, and the National Health Service wouldn't be in the terrible state it's in at the moment if those views had been heard more widely. Almost everything that was said on this station about that during that period has been demonstrated to be true. So the fact is, dissent is good for a country, not bad for a country. A country which suppresses dissent harms itself. Yeah,
absolutely. Peter, you talk a lot of sense. It's been an absolute pleasure to have your company for the last half hour. Thank you so much. That's Peter Hitchens there, who is a columnist for The Mail on Sunday.